Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher, Beckett again with another historical video. Today, we're back on that grind, and we are starting the time period following World War One, the 1920s, the time of prosperity. So sit back, relax, and let's get some notes being taken. Let's share this. Let's get on. Let's get on with it. The Roaring Twenties, Module 8, Chapter 8. Same thing. The Business of America. All right, so that was your warm up. Objectives, we're going to critique the ineffectiveness of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. We're going to discuss the importance of the automobile had on American life and summarize the role of new technology changing the way Americans live during the 1920s. Oh my. Lots of red. 1920s, the American people were weary with war and the zeal of the progressive era. The lies. Hashtag. Post-war economy had been faltering. Strikes and riots disrupted cities, and voters wanted peace and quiet. Warren G. Harding's election reflected those attitudes as he promised normalcy if he were to be elected. And he will win in a landslide victory. After World War I, problems about arms control, war debts, and the reconstruction of war-torn countries surfaced. 1921, Harding invited several major powers to the Washington Naval Conference, aka Washington Disarmament Conference. Disarmament, get rid of guns. Russia, however, was left out because of its communist government. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes urged that no more warships were to be built for 10 years. He suggested that the five naval powers, US, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, scrap many of their battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. And for the first time in history, powerful nations agreed to disarm. In 1928, 15 countries will sign something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Test question, which renounced war as a national policy. The pact, however, was futile, as it provided no means of enforcement. That's Warren G. And here's a little political cartoon, kind of funny, right? We got Europe pushing the baby League of Nations, and you got the United States. Hey, the Woodrow Wilson created the League of Nations. The U.S. Senate denied entrance, ratification of it. So even though our president, remember, created the League of Nations, we did not join. So you got the baby saying, Papa, as Uncle Sam is trying to make a new peace pact with a pretty lady and a Boyd. All right, the Dawes Plan. New conflicts arose when it came time for Britain and France to pay back the $10 billion they borrowed. Two ways they could do it: sell goods to the US or by collecting reparations from Germany. But in 1922, the US adopted the Fordney-McCumber tariff, which raised taxes on some businesses from foreign competition. But it will make it impossible for Britain and France to sell enough goods back to the United States to repay those debts. Kind of smart by the US. Make more money off Britain and France by taxing their imports. Britain and France, BNF, then looked to Germany, who was experiencing terrible inflation. When Germany defaulted on their payment, make it in time, French troops moved into the Ruhr Valley. It was rich area in resources between France and Germany. To avoid another war, which was possible, American banker Charles Dawes was sent to negotiate the loans. Test question: Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan was speak, Alex, Mr. Ovalle. American investors loaned Germany $2.5 billion to Germany to pay back Britain and France with annual payments on a fixed scale. Then Britain and France would pay back that money to the United States. However, this caused resentment all around. Britain and France disliked how the U.S. wasn't paying their fair share of the costs of World War I. The U.S. had benefited from the German defeat, while the Europeans paid for the victory with the deaths of millions. At the same time, the U.S. considered Britain and France financially irresponsible. Hello. Let's go on to the next slide. Thank you very much. So it's like a triangle. The U.S. loans money to Germany. Germany pays $2.5 billion in reparations, and the Allies pay $2.6 billion back. So, they make that money. Limited government role. So Harding believed the best answer to the nation's post-war economic struggles could be found in his campaign slogan, less government in business and more business in government. Harding wanted to cut the federal budget and reduce taxes on the wealthiest of Americans. Harding believed that the wealthy were the ones who started and expanded businesses. By taxing them less, businesses would grow and pull the nation out of these hard times. However, these policies worked only for short-lived prosperity. His cabinet were a bunch of his cronies, his friends, his homies. Secretary of State Charles Edward Evans Hughes would become the new Supreme Court Chief Justice. Herbert Humphrey Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce. Andrew Mellon became the Secretary of the Treasury. And this so-called Ohio gang would soon cause a great deal of embarrassment. So here you got the Ohio gang. I don't know where to find them. So I have a funny quote to read, and you might not think it's funny, but I think it's hilarious. I don't know where to find him. That's what the president said. The president's main problem is that he didn't understand many of these issues, and he will admit as much to his secretary in the book. And I quote, where is it? John? I'm reading it from the book right here. John, I can't make a thing out of this tax problem. I listen to one side and they seem right. And then I talk to the other side and they seem just as right. I know somewhere there's an economist who knows the truth, but I don't know where to find him and having the sense to know him and to trust him when I find him. What a job! Oh man, so funny. So funny. Man doesn't even know how to be a president. Harding's discomfort with policy details contributed to his inability to see the criminal behavior going on right under his nose. Harding's administration began to crumble as his corrupt friends engaged in graft. Ooh, graft. There's a $5 word. Remember graft from the industrialization period? New York, Tammany Hall. And graft is using their offices improperly to become wealthy. So Charles R. Forbes, not that guy, was the head of the Veterans Bureau, was caught selling government and hospital supplies to private companies for profit. Colonel Thomas Miller was head of the Office of Alien Property and was caught taking a bribe. So again, Forbes magazine is not made after this guy, okay? And that's the Colonel. Teapot Dome. Test question. The most spectacular example of corruption was the Teapot Dome scandal. The government had set aside oil-rich public lands at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, for the use by the U.S. Navy. Secretary of the Interior Albert B. Fall, who was friends with many oil executives at the time, managed to get those oil reserves transferred from the Navy to the Interior Department. Then Fall secretly leased the lands of the two private oil companies, including Harry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company at Teapot Dome. Although Fall claimed that these contracts were done in the government's interest, he suddenly received more than $400,000 in loans, bonds, and cash. He was later found guilty of bribery and became the first American to be convicted of a felony while holding a cabinet post. Remember, cabinet are the top people of all the departments inside the government. They're the president's homies. In the summer of 1923, Warren G. Harding declared, "I have no problem with my enemies, but my friends, they're the real ones that keep me up walking the floor nights at night." It was a weird quote, I know. Shortly thereafter, Harding will die, probably from a heart attack or stroke, RIP. Americans sincerely mourned for their good-natured president, but the crimes of Harding's cabinet were coming to light as Vice President Calvin Coolidge assumed the presidency. Coolidge was a respected man of integrity who helped restore the people's faith in their government and the Republican Party. The next year, Coolidge would be elected president. So here you got the Teapot Dome scandal. It's a runaway, what do you call those? Rollers. I mean, that's a roller. I can't think of it. But the White House highway is dat-away, and the Teapot Dome scandal is heading towards the White House. That's Albert B. Fall. Albert B. Fallen with that style of hat. Laissez who? So, new President Calvin Coolidge fit into the pro-business spirit of the 1920s very well. He said the chief business of the American people is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there. Both Coolidge and his successor, Triple H, Herbert Humphrey Hoover, favored government policies that would keep taxes down and business profits up and give businesses more available credit in order to expand. Their goal was to minimize government involvement in business and to allow private enterprise to flourish. Where have I heard that before? It was an echo of the laissez-faire economic policy of the late 19th century industrialization period, the idea that the business should not be regulated by the government, hands-off laissez-faire economics. For most of the 1920s, this tactic seemed to work. Coolidge's administration continued to place high tariffs on foreign imports, which helped American manufacturers. Reducing income taxes meant that people had more money in their pockets, wages were rising, and so too was productivity. That's a young Calvin Coolidge, as cool as the other side of the pillow. Big bank. The auto industry was one of the biggest business successes of the 1920s. Test question, Henry Ford and his Model T led the way. To create the Model T, Ford used several methods to make production as efficient and cost-effective as possible. He will use something called the assembly line manufacturing, there needs to be a comma there, increased pay for his workers, and avoided changes in the car's design. Other industries learned from Ford as manufacturers began to using assembly line techniques to make different types of products in large quantities at lower costs. During the 1920s, productivity, the measure of output per unit, such as labor, rose about 45%. Americans were producing more in less time, which helped the growth of American manufacturers. And there's our boy, young Henry Ford and his car. Imagine steering like that today. Oh no! Yeet! Skirt, skirt. Cars. The automobile literally changed the American landscape. Its most visible effect was the construction of paved roads and suitable for driving in all types of weather. One such road was the legendary Route 66, which provided a route of people trekking out west from Chicago to California. It went downwards, however. I don't have a map, but it went down and out. In addition to the changing landscape, architectural styles also changed as new houses typically came equipped with a garage or carport and a driveway, now had a smaller lawn as a result. The automobile also launched the rapid construction of gasoline stations, repair shops, public garages, motels, tourist camps, and shopping centers. The first traffic lights were lit up in Detroit in the early 1920s, and the Holland Tunnel connecting New York City to Jersey City underwater opened in 1927. So we had the technology to drive underwater, put stuff underwater, 1927. Crazy. These are some cars. That's a gas station. Look at that. 8 cents. 8 cents per gallon. My gosh. And there's Route 66. What a nice picture. 100 years later, the automobile liberated the isolated rural family who could now travel to the city for shopping and entertainment. It also gave families the opportunity to vacation in new and faraway places. It allowed both women and young people to become more independent through increased mobility. It allowed workers to live miles from their jobs and resulting in urban sprawl as cities spread in all directions. The automobile also provided an economic base for cities as Akron, Ohio, where several tire companies were headquartered, in Michigan cities like Detroit, Dearborn, Flint, and Pontiac, where all the cars were manufactured. The industry drew people to oil-producing states like California and Tejas. The automobile became a status symbol, both for individual families and to the rest of the world. The auto industry symbolized the success of the free enterprise system and the Coolidge era. Nowhere in the world could people with little money own their own automobile. But by the late 1920s, 80% of all registered motor vehicles were in the United States, about one car for every 5 people. Will Rogers, a comedian, I think he's a comedian or he's a humorist, said to Henry Ford once, "It will take 100 years to tell whether you helped us or you hurt us. Hmm. But you certainly didn't leave us where you found us." Take off. RIP. Automobiles weren't the only industry taking off. The airplane industry began as a mail carrying service for the US Post Office. Although the first flight in 1918 was a disaster, the number of successful flights soon established the airplane as a peacetime means of transportation. With the development of weather forecasting, planes began carrying radios and navigational instruments. Henry Ford made a tri-motor plane in the 1926. Transatlantic flights by Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart helped promote cargo and commercial airlines. In 1927, the Lockheed Company produced a single-engine plane, the Vega. It was the most popular transport airplanes of the late 1920s. Pan American Airways logged the first transatlantic passenger flight. So there's Charles Lindbergh on the left, his Spirit of St. Louis, and Amelia Earhart on the right. And there's Pan American flight it's a water passenger thing. So I mean, hey, if you're going to crash over water, you kind of want to have these things so then you can just mosey on your way. The American Dream. 1920s were a prosperous time for the US. It seemed like the American dream was coming true. Americans owned about 40% of the world's wealth, and that wealth changed the way most Americans live. The average annual income, money made a year, increased from more than 35% during this period, from $522 a year to $705 a year. Consumerism began to play a significant role in the American economy and culture. Gasoline powered much of the economic boom in the 1920s, but it was the use of electricity that transformed the nation. American factories used electricity to run machines. The development of alternating electrical current made it possible to distribute electrical power efficiently over longer distances. Now, electricity was no longer restricted to the central cities, but could be transmitted to the suburbs. The electrification of new areas of the country made it possible for the people to use this latest home conveniences. By the late 1920s, more and more homes had electric irons, while well-to-do families used electric refrigerators, cooking ranges, vacuum cleaners, and toasters. New refrigerators, freezers, might hold foods quick, frozen by a process developed by a guy named Clarence Birdseye. Homemakers could save time by shopping at the new self-service grocery stores. What a novelty. And the new appliances and food preparation options made the lives of housewives easier, freed them to do other community and leisure activities, and coincided with a growing trend that more and more women were working outside the home. So here you have a fridge on the top left. Here's the first ever stove. Look at this Hoover vacuum. And look, self-service grocery stores. Can you believe that? All right, clickbait. With new goods flooding the market, advertising agencies no longer just informed the public about products and prices. They hired psychologists to study how to appeal to people's desire for youthfulness, beauty, health, and wealth. The results were impressive. The slogan, "Say it with flowers," doubled florists' businesses between 1912 to 1924. Reach for a lucky instead of a sweet lured weight-conscious Americans to cigarettes and away from candy. Brand names became familiar coast to coast, and luxury items now seem like necessities. One of those necessities, however, for example, your book says it, was mouthwash. Listerine advertisements aimed to convince readers that without mouthwash, a person ran the risk of having halitosis, bad breath. And one of those results could be a bad breath. Business people applied the power of advertising to other areas of American life. Across the land, they met with fellow members of such service organizations of Rotary, Kiwanis, and the Lions clubs. As one observer noted, they sang songs, raised money for charities, and boosted the image of businessmen as a builder, a doer of great things, yes, and a dreamer whose imaginations was ever seeking out new ways of serving humanity. And many Americans idolized these businessmen during these prosperous times. To keep a slender figure, No one can deny. Reach for a lucky instead of a sweet. National Pure Rolled White Oats makes kids husky. Here's an Oreo ad, a Maybelline ad, a Coca-Cola ad. That's cap. During the 1920s, most Americans believed prosperity would go on forever. The average worker was producing 50% more at the end of the decade than it did at its start, and some questions came about. Well, had the national income grew from $64 billion to $87 billion in 8 years, from 1921 to 1929? Weren't most corporations making fortunes? Wasn't the stock market reaching new heights? As the adoption of mass production techniques increased productivity, businesses expanded. There were numerous mergers of companies that manufactured automobiles, steel, and electrical equipment, as well as mergers of companies that provided public utilities. Chain stores sprouted, selling groceries, drugs, shoes, and clothes. 5 and dime stores like Woolworths also spread rapidly. Mail order catalogs allowed Americans who lived far away from big cities to buy the attractive new products. Congress now passed a law that allowed national banks to open branch offices within cities where their main office was located. As the number of businesses grew, however, so too did the income gap between workers and managers. There were a number of clouds in the blue sky of prosperity. The iron and railroad industries, among others, weren't very prosperous. The farms nationwide suffered losses. Why? Because the new machinery they were using were producing more and more food than was needed, and this drove down prices. When you flood a market, the demand isn't there, prices go down, and you don't make as much money as you used to. Last slide, more cap. In addition to advertising, industry provided another solution to the problem of luring customers to purchase the mountain of goods produced each year. Credit. Don't fall into this trap. The installment plan was, as it was called, enabled people to buy goods over an extended period of time without having to put much money down at the time of purchase. That's a test question. Banks provided the money at low interest rates. Advertisers pushed the installment plan idea with the slogan, "You furnish the girl, we'll furnish the home, and enjoy while you pay." Some economists and business owners worry that the installment buying might be getting out of hand. They fear that this practice is really a sign of fundamental weaknesses behind a superficial economic prosperity. Still, most Americans focus their attention on the present and what could possibly go wrong with the nation's economy in the future. We're rich, filthy rich. With little concern there was for the years ahead, often took the form of speculation, test question, or investing in risky ventures in hopes that prices would rise and big profits would result. Speculation would eventually spell out financial disaster for many investors, and the decades of the 1920s brought about many technological and economic changes, yet the Coolidge era was built on a paradox. The president stood for the economy and a frugal way of life, but he was favored by a public who had thrown all care into the wind. Yeet! And there was very little warning of what was to come next. Whew! And here you got a political cartoon, Uncle Sam, the peak of prosperity. Uncle Sam looking down on ancient Rome. All right. Well, that concludes this video. So your homework is to do page 369, questions 3 through 5. Okay. So hopefully you guys did enjoy. I mean, we're starting the 1920s off hot. I know it was a longer type of video, but we got to have a base if we're getting ready for what's to come next. All right. Hopefully you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.